All right. Welcome everyone to this Montana Book Festival event. This is a conversation with Ed Skoog and Justin Taylor. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. Again, thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our Collector's Edition sponsor, Whitefish Review. In supporting us, you're supporting contemporary literature in the American West. We are so grateful to have you on board this year. Right now, I'm really excited to welcome Ed and Justin, and I'll read their bios before letting them just kick it off. So Ed Skoog was born in Topeka, Kansas in 1971. He is the author of 3 previous books of poems, Mr. Skylight, Rough Day, and Run the Red Lights. His poems have appeared in Harper's, the Paris Review, the American Poetry Review, the New Republic, Poetry, and the Best American Poetry. He has been a Breadloaf Fellow, a Lannan Foundation Marfa Residency Fellow, and Writer-in-Residence at George Washington University and the Richard Hugo House. He is a coordinator of the Idlewild Arts Summer Writers Week and co-host with novelist J. Robert Lennon, the podcast Lunchbox. He is a visiting writer at the University of Montana, or he was at the time of that bio writing, and lives in Portland. Justin Taylor is the author of the short story collections Everything Here is the Best Thing Ever and Flings, and the novel The Gospel of Anarchy. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the New Yorker, Harper's, the Sewanee Review, N+1, the New York Times Book Review, and Literary Hub. He lives in Portland, Oregon. All right, you two, welcome and chat away.
All right, hello.
Ed, you're muted.
I was muted. I will now stop talking. While Justin drinks a glass of water, I will talk to prove to you that I'm no dummy. Justin, I hope you noticed that I shaved since you last saw me.
I did. So did I, actually. That's good.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, we both look so much younger. We resemble our younger selves, which is ourselves before March 13th, when we were both teaching at the University of Montana. We were living together in the X's. Which one of the X's?
The second X, the lower X.
The Vidal Sassoon apartments.
Yeah, not
Siegfried Sassoon apartments.
Yeah, the Vita Echo West apartments.
And we both had books that were about to come out.
Mm-hmm.
Travelers Leaving for the City in my case, Riding with the Ghost in your case. And we were so excited about the prospect of a 2020 in which we got to go all around the world, really, telling people about our new books of poetry and memoir. And then an event happened, and I hadn't shaved from that day until yesterday, to try to put on a new face for the new phase, in which I try to remember that I had a book come out, because until I couldn't even remember what the book was as I was trying to get my copy to bring down to read a little bit from and to talk about it. It seemed kind of like a non-event, and I'm not sure why and what that says about the publishing of a book in a normal time, or what a book is. But we're going to talk about music and memory.
I know what those things are.
Right. I was trying to remember what it is that you might be about to say on these subjects.
Oh, I don't know. I haven't said it yet.
What have you been up to?
Well, about the same as you. Mostly staying in the house. I was taking long walks every day. It's been a lot of the last 4 or 5 months. Then, in your words, something happened a few days ago that made leaving the house impossible. So.
Are you? Yeah, I'm in a basement. Are you in a basement? Actually, with the background that you have, it looks like you're actually lying on the floor, and the camera is attached to a chandelier, perhaps, or the Roses style, and is about to collapse on you.
This is the second time I have been told that I look like I'm lying on the floor when I sit in front of this background. I was told I looked like I was lying on the floor in a bowling alley, specifically.
Yeah, the perspective, it feels very precarious.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent the last 5 months building a bowling alley.
Drink your milkshake. Do you have a copy of your book with you?
I do.
Want to hold it up to the
Yeah,
camera so people can see it?
I have a copy of your book with me too.
Oh, I don't have your copy. You beat me.
That's why I did it.
I have your other book. Here. Some of your other recent work. Let's talk about music in memory. We thought of that as an idea because I think both of our work has one of the things we have in common as people and as writers is music obsession.
Yeah.
Which luckily I think I think it's shared with most people. I'm always shocked when I meet somebody who doesn't hasn't dedicated most of their free time to developing opinions about out of print music.
Well, all writers wish they were musicians. I mean, you have a bit of an advantage there because you actually play.
Mm. I play banjo, which puts me right back at the disadvantage position as far as being a musician. But clearly for both of us, music is important to us as people and in our worlds. And I think more than some other writers, I think it helps guide what we write about, how we write about it. I think the music for both of us has created analogies for our styles and for the structure of our work.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think there's a lot of music, I think in your work, both in, artists who are name checked or discussed, in the new book too, but I'm especially thinking of, there's a few poems in Run the Red Lights in the previous book. I think there's one about playing the banjo. There's that wonderful poem about the Grateful Dead that I really love, about finding the trays of old bootleg tapes and seeing them in 95. And I know for me, having written this memoir about my father, also someone who spent his whole life wishing he was a musician and did absolutely nothing ever to try and make that happen. Music was extremely important to him. And so a lot of the structure of this book is around music. Several of the chapters take their names from song titles or snatches of lyrics, and sort of a whole subplot at one point about these boxes of my father's records and my attempt to get him reunited with them after he'd left them in a storage unit. So I don't know how to finish this sentence, but maybe.
Well, that passage was, I mean, that chapter was excerpted in Harper's, I believe. That was the first thing many people read from this book, and it's great. Is there a passage from the book that you have selected to read?
Yeah, actually, I could read a little passage here, and then maybe you'll read from Travelers Leaving for the City, and then we can just spend the rest of the hour praising each other. Does that sound good to you?
That sounds good.
All right.
Especially, yeah.
So let me read a little bit here. So this is about the storage unit that I just mentioned, and just to give you the briefest précis or overview that what you may need to know. This is a book about my father, about his and my relationship, his variously depression, poverty, and what turned out to be the last 10 years of his life, primarily, and the first year after he died, and my attempts to reconsider our relationship and just think about things in light of that loss. So that's sort of the frame of the book. In the section I'm going to read, you'll hear a bit about music and a bit about driving. You may catch some names of characters that are unfamiliar. I would say just let all that kind of drift on by. It shouldn't really disrupt the experience. But in this, I am attempting to deal with my father's stuff and also to get him to move from Nashville to South Florida. After my cousin bought Dad the apartment because it was cheaper in the long run than renting one for him, to say nothing of what it was costing per week for the home, there arose the issue of reuniting him with his belongings. This must have been late 2013 or early 2014. At least some of the stuff, as he always called it, was really all of ours. Family pictures, sets of dishes, mine, my sister's childhood things, book collections, school projects, stuffed animals, whatever else. But most of it was his. Boxes and boxes of papers from jobs he held decades ago, ancient tax records, his vinyl collection. In the old days, he always had the radio on or the turntable going, belting along as the mood struck, at home or in the car, or even in public sometimes, singing half under his breath. After he sold the house and moved into the hotel, he stopped listening to music and was perfectly frank about the fact that he would probably never own another record player. In fact, he did own a record player, along with stereo receiver and speakers, the same rig he'd had since the 70s, kept in mint condition all these years, and it still sounded good as new. It was in the storage unit with the rest of the stuff. But he didn't want to listen to music, had no interest in hearing the grand anthems and love songs of his heyday. All those lyrics he still knew by heart but would no longer sing along with. He had, of course, not so long ago told my sister that the collection was probably worth some money and suggested she try to sell it. And yet, now the idea of parting with the records had become unthinkable to him. All the stuff was in a storage unit in Nashville, and he was in South Florida, and he wanted it all shipped to him. My mother, for her part, was ready to be rid of the storage unit, which she had been paying for years. Christ, the way these things have dragging on. So it feels like time itself has gone gummy. Every issue a quicksand, poverty, depression, indecision, a black hole that neither spits you out nor sucks you in. By the time this imbroglio resolved itself, the very word stuff was effectively soiled. To this day, my wife cringes to hear it. Dad hadn't wanted to leave the stuff behind in Nashville in the first place. He was quick to point out that we wouldn't be having this problem now if we'd just listened to him and then brought it with us when we moved him. But this, I reminded him, had been impossible because at the time the family did not trust him to make the drive alone, and my sister was in law school. So it fell to me to drive with him, and I had been living in New York for so long that I didn't trust myself to drive a U-Haul with a car hitched to it. Plus, I didn't mention this to him. It had taken so long to get him to agree to move back to Florida that we were racing to get it done before he could change his mind. Compared to that problem, the idea of the stuff seemed nebulous and abstract. It was just a bunch of old shit in boxes, right? He hadn't needed it for this long. Nobody had needed any of it. We said to each other that once we got him settled in South Florida, his sense of imperative would soften, maybe disappear. This was a lie we told ourselves. We all knew Dad better than that. I'll stop there.
Great. Do you have much of a vinyl collection of your own right now?
A little bit. I mean, nothing like what he had, but I have a record player and we've been slowly but surely collecting. It's nice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought I'd just read a short poem from Travelers Leaving for the City. This is called The Portland Water, which is a song by
Michael Hurley.
Michael Hurley. My mind was telling me Moondog Jr., which is a common mistake. The Portland Water. The gasoline of mowing brings rosemary into the noon. Children are picking their noses, telling each other about skin color, and pretending their parents are dead. Far away, Porky Pig is peeling wallpaper with a lotus egg. And the dog paddles in his sleep. There is swimming in the river now. Some thrown rock side saddles to the bottom. Suicides return in longboats. Walk around for an hour. The sun is working at its sunglass hut. An invisible escalator running in my head is called desire. The river is piss, an ag runoff and quilted by a recurring breeze and deferment of a salmon beauty no one swims all the way across that you hear about. Out here, where the gravel is, the mimosa's long feathery branches with confectionery frill, tranquil in its dry way. Out here, where the gravel is, walled and unwalled cities of grief, cities you hold, indifferent city, curbless streets, potholed down to truck, tarp, broken boat, the dumpster left over, a renovation that faltered. Crowds of teenagers are necessary. The shit they break needs breaking. Out here where the gravel is. The world is a falling room. What sand thoughts my sleep rolled me into curtains show no draw, and yet night's shell has broken open. My son, who'd climbed into bed, where is he now? Not every night do I look down at the ledge, but there he is on the floor, and I am the one who lifts him, like a helicopter flying a bladder from the lake to drop on the fire. I'm the fire, burning home in the dark for anything broken or bruised. The shit they break needs breaking. I stay awake and plan the day ahead, out here where the gravel is, singed and collapsing. The poem doesn't directly reference the song, I guess. Fire, water, that sort of thing.
It's especially appropriate at the moment.
Yeah, I didn't realize it until I don't remember the poems until I read them, because I don't remember writing them, which is true. So I'm always surprised to find out what I said.
I think I know what you mean by that, but would you say some more about that? What do you mean when you say you don't remember writing them?
Well, I say these aren't even. Say something.
I like that poem.
Okay, very good. Yeah, they're not even using the headphones. Aren't even. It's coming in through the speaker.
Working, they're purely ornamental.
Yeah, they're just. I thought they were pretty, and they are. Well, writing this book, writing each book has been different. I don't have a customary way of writing. Like I don't have a routine or a practice. I mean, I write everything differently, and I don't know when it's going to happen or when I'm going to feel like writing a bunch or feel like revising a bunch. But this book particularly felt very much guided in cooperation with the language. There's a quote from Robert Duncan saying, I don't use language, I cooperate with it. And I felt that was very true. In this case, I felt very much like I was cooperating with language, and to some degree with the spirit, real or imagined, of my grandfather, who I didn't know, and who the book is about his murder a long time ago, and its effect on the way that the family that I grew up in created itself, and the relationship of family to language. So when I say I cooperated with language on this, I feel like it was a kind of collaboration in which I don't feel like I added very much. I can look back and see drafts and notebooks, but it occurred to me as I was putting it together into a manuscript that I really didn't recall writing it, and that may be an indication of something I need to take up with my my internist. But I think it was just something in the nature of these poems, and had an effect on their style, that it was a more of an act of the imagination than my previous books had been.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's certain kinds of writing that you do where you're really building towards something, and then maybe there's other kinds of writing that one does that are really about the moment of composition and the experience, and then the piece that ends up getting written is a sort of document or record of that. But it sort of is what it is. I mean, I was definitely thinking as I was rereading Travelers this week that it seems much more fragmented within each poem than the previous book, certainly, but maybe than any of your work. But yet at the same time, the poems are much more in conversation with each other. There are images, phrases, characters that recur all throughout. And at times it occurred to me to wonder whether to think of this as a book of poems or as a long poem in sections or what. And so it's an
I
interesting.
think it's the latter. Yeah, I think this and my second book, Rough Day, are really long poems, long single poems with breaks. You know.
I mean, I find that really fascinating and kind of exciting, actually, that the thing can be, in one sense, fragmentary, but at the same time, really very open and fluid, and that the pieces are not isolated by virtue of being fragmented, but actually maybe more in communication with each other, for that very reason.
Yeah, well, I mean, it started out as, I tried to write this story. It isn't a story. The book of poems is not a story, but I began trying to write it as a story, both in fiction and nonfiction, which are just not my forte. It's not the way my brain works. And what I was working on, in some ways, the book's a novel, except I didn't want to call it that because that would create expectations that would satisfy no one. But it was an analogy I had in my head in which, a period of time, a beginning, middle, and an end. But more useful because of the fractured and scattered and restless nature of how I write. I'm not valorizing any of those when I say it. Is my need for some sort of structural principle. I see one or two people who are attending were in my prosody class last year, so they know that that's something I've given a lot of thought to. Is structure, not necessarily in a traditional way, but just this sense that things have a structure, and to be aware of the structures that you're creating, the figure that a poem makes in the mind. And I've always found, from starting out, that the structural analogies I work with tend to be musical analogies rather than visual art analogies, like I think a lot of other poets do, or architectural analogies or liturgical analogies.
What are some of those music analogies?
Well, starting out, there's something in the roughness and unevenness, which is, I tell myself, has something to do with the raggedness of Bill Monroe's mandolin playing. That's sort of an analogy for me, which is brilliant and virtuosic, but also inventive and off time, lots of wrong notes, but kind of the soul showing through in a vocabulary that the creator, in this case Bill Monroe, otherwise had no access to.
I often think about that when listening to the Grateful Dead, in particular to Jerry Garcia, of whom I would simultaneously say possibly the greatest performer on the guitar, and one of the great vocalists, maybe of all time. But then also, if he could ever keep a fucking key and note, he'd really be on his way. And there's something about that maybe actually be what keeps me, and I would venture to say us, coming back to that over and over again. It's so far beyond anything, and yet it's so unfinished and raw in a certain way.
We admire mastery and virtuosity, but we don't really connect with it, right? We don't see ourselves in it, or only a narcissist would see themselves in something executed perfectly. So James Booker's, and just sort of the New Orleans style of piano playing, James Booker, Professor Longhair, Eddie Bow, and others, is another sort of very syncopated, excessive style that I've thought consciously about as a structure for my poems. But what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I also, I had never written a book like this before. I hadn't planned to write a memoir, and wasn't actually particularly enthusiastic about it, even after that's what I figured out that I was doing. And so I turned to structure in a lot of different ways to really help me through. I mean, I mostly write short stories, and one of my favorite things about a story is the moment when it reveals its structure, because it's such a small form that it can, much like a poem, I think, it can really be very loose and almost formless, and you just keep messing with it or letting it do what it wants, and eventually it crystallizes in some way, and you go, oh, that's, you know, that's what that is, and then you move on with your life. But it's very difficult to do that at the scale of a full-length book. And so yeah, I relied very heavily on, for certain chapters, like the idea of a notebook, and for others, just I don't know how to say it, but I guess at a certain point I started thinking about it as a like essentially like a record, like an A side and a B side, which it is. I mean, the book is in two parts, and you know, the kind of flip in the record is the loss of my father, in a certain way. And that was an idea that came to me actually. I mean, there's, you know, plenty of history of, yeah, you know, the idea of how you organize records and stuff. But about 10 years ago, I had interviewed the musician Jason Molina a few years before he died. And he's a musician that was very important to me. And his song, I've Been Riding with the Ghost, ended up giving my book its title. He talked a lot about the A and B sides of records, and how even though for most of his career he was, you know, publishing music to CDs and digital and whatever, that was really how he thought of the albums that he made, that they were, there was a whole and then there was a middle, and the A and the B broke the way they broke for a reason. And I got really obsessed with that idea, in maybe an unhealthy way, but ultimately I think it helped me give the thing a shape. I was extremely, there's 6 chapters and then a break and then 5, and I tell you, I may have spent more time than on anything else trying to figure out where to get a 6th chapter into the second part so that they would be even. And I finally just had to admit that maybe that wasn't exactly what Molina had meant. You know, that it could be 6 and 5 and still be in 2 parts. But I wanted that symmetry, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think the analogies that I've borrowed from a lot of music are, and I think any analogy for writing is often superficial. Not that that's superficial, but like, you know, but like the structure is not necessarily like, I'm not borrowing the deep structure of Bill Monroe's musical, you know, the way a musicologist might find it, right? I'm just kind of borrowing a notion, a structural notion from it, rather, and then making it my own, rather than really programmatic. There's one of the reporters covering the fires going on 20 miles away from us, 15 miles away from us. Yesterday said that was trying to explain to people how close the fires were to Portland, but also how distant. And he suggested that a good unit of measure for Portlanders would be the length of a Bon Iver album. He said it's half of a Bon Iver album from downtown Portland to where the fire line is. So that was useful.
That is extremely useful to a very small but real group of people.
It's a Portland unit of measure.
Yeah. It's a 73 dark stars away.
Yeah. And ultimately, I mean, for poetry specifically, I mean, when you're talking about structure, New York, I mean, it is kind of units of measure is really what you're borrowing from something, you know.
You mean like the line, or like
the lines and stanzas and spaces, you know, sentence style, everything really comes down to choices about measurement.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't sound very inspirational, but I think it's true. You made a playlist for your book on Large Hearted Boy.
I did.
I believe the link is in the chat. You want to walk us through some of those choices?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I won't put you through the whole thing, but you know, Large Hearted Boy, for people who don't know it, is this really wonderful website that's been going on for, I don't even know how long now, for long enough that I've done one for every book that I've published, and this is the 4th one. And they invite authors to make playlists to go with their books. And I think in the past, for the first few books that I wrote, I tended to write about the music that was in the short stories. And then for this one, I don't know quite why, but I ended up taking a very different approach. I think because my book felt like it was a lot to me about driving and movement and being on the road, that I wrote about songs that I listened to on the road a lot. So Magnolia Electric Company, I've been riding with the Ghost, which I mentioned, that's in there. There's a great Grant Hart, the guy from Husker Du, a great short record called Hot Wax that I really love. And I would say of all the Grant Hart solo material I listen to, which is probably not much to begin with, but that's the one I come back to the most often. And there's an amazing song on there called California Zephyr. It's basically about him, I think, running away from Minnesota to the Bay in the 70s, maybe whenever he was an adolescent, to kind of go see the world and find community out there. And it's just a song about taking trains and making friends and stuff. There's I think, was there something in particular that you were thinking about, Ed, or just interested to, because you made a playlist also?
I did make a playlist, which I think I spent more time. This is at the request of Copper Canyon Press, which is asks many of its authors to do this. And I think I probably spent more time on the playlist than I did on the book. I think it was April when I was putting it together. It was, sort of in pandemic mind, and this seemed like a good thing to spend 40 hours doing. But I realized that at the very least I should have in the playlist the songs that I reference, right? Because a number of poems that songs that I create or titles or other things. So the Supremes' "Love Is Like an Itching in My Heart" is really important to a lot of the book. "The Portland Water" by Michael Hurley. "Didn't I Blow Your Mind This Time" by the Delphonics. It's one of the longer sequences in the book is about it's about murder, but it's sort of going from the connections between the words Tarentum, where the murder happened, to Tarantula, which is connected, and Tarantella and Tarantino, which all have the same root, and so there's a passage about the movie Jackie Brown, particularly the song "Didn't I Blow Your Mind This Time?" So I included that. There's a poem about Widespread Panic, a band that I have no strong opinion about, and that you and I, as being very tolerant of jam bands, also didn't seem to have any strong opinion about. But I found a couple of songs from Widespread Panic that seemed to fit the bill. Also, the key event in the book takes place in February 1955. So I looked at the music that people would have been on the radio at the time, as some sort of entry point into the world of the book, which I had done when I was writing it. I sort of immersed myself in 1955 kind of cultural detritus. So some of that's in here: Cherry Pink and Apple Blossom White, and some like things that weren't quite rock and roll.
Early rock and roll.
Early rock and roll. Right. And then I just put in a lot of pretty awesome jams. I encourage anyone to follow the link. And if you are unfamiliar with these excellent choices I've made, you can adopt them as your own. But I think if you're listening, watching, this is if you aren't already searching the encounters with art for your own art, it's something to think about, because it's such a big part of how my imagination moves. And I know plenty of writers who keep these things separate, and I think it's to the poverty of their work. I think it's enriched the experience of writing for me, and again, it stokes the pretense that I have something in common with other artists just because I have my own form of art, which is probably not, I think is not necessarily defensible in the long run, but gives me some sort of self-flattery, which is what I need in order to move forward.
I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense, and in a certain way, maybe the value, or part of the value, is just the way that focusing on a different art form or a specific piece of art, maybe even if it's just another piece of writing, but I think especially if it's outside, film, music, something that is not the thing that you're doing, it clarifies the attention, and it focuses the mind in a certain way, and it allows you to come back to your own work with a new perspective, maybe carrying a little bit of that fire with you, that very focus that you sometimes are hesitant to give yourself. You give into self-doubt, or you become distracted or whatever, but something about the nature of obsession and paying attention to something else, trying to understand this thing that somebody else made that you love but don't quite know why, can be very clarifying, I think, and salutary. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I like writing book reviews. We were talking earlier about how just distracted and hazy and disastrous and basically fucked the past 5 or 6 months have been. And I would say for me, some of the clearest and sanest that I have felt is when I've taken review assignments that forced me to really think deeply about somebody else's body of work that I admire, and then develop a cogent argument around it.
You published some reviews recently of the Susan Minot, her new collection of short stories,
who was a Montana discovery for me. I was hand sold a collection of hers back in February, and at Fact and Fiction, actually, I think, one of the bookstores in town, and absolutely fell in love with it, and ended up reading a ton of her stuff. And then this new book came around, and and so that's kind of what I'm saying, like that opportunity just to say, okay, well, I've read these 5 books, but what do I really think, and how will I say it? It makes me feel good. I mean, I think I actually like just walking around in my daily life, like doing the dishes and and reading the paper, like feel saner for that.
Right. You write about music, not so much not like record reviews, although you probably have done that, but other features related to music or musicians and interviews. How do you write about music differently than you would write about fiction?
I mean, I think the main difference, honestly, is that I would abandon any pretense of authority. I mean, I'm pretty suspicious of any pretense of authority, even in literary criticism, beyond simply saying, I read this, I thought about this, I'm speaking from the experience of myself as a reader or whatever. But with music, I think because I don't play, I don't read it, I don't even really have the language for it, I don't particularly have an ear for it. I mean, I really have nothing but a amateur's enthusiasm, that may even be not just amateurish but naive in certain ways. I mean, it's as unformed as it could be, and I really cherish that. And so in writing about any music or musician, I feel really liberated by that. There is, I know any claim to authority or expertise I would make is totally false and unearned, and so there's no temptation to make one. And that's, I think that's really nice. I mean, it's something I try to model in my writing about writing also in a certain way, but if you stay in this game long enough, almost against your better judgment, a certain amount of expertise accrues, I suppose, sort of calcifies on you. But Ed, what I was thinking of is we were talking about writers who write about music, but musicians who write about music are also interesting. And I was thinking about Robbie Fulks, who you and I spent a lot of the spring thinking about. I think Fulks modeled this kind of obsession in a really interesting way. And he's a wonderful prose writer as well. This is a piece you turned me on to. His epic study of Gordon Lightfoot.
So I'm going to put that. I'm going to get the link from that.
That should definitely go in the chat.
Yeah.
So Ed got a little obsessed with this Robbie Fulks essay on Gordon Lightfoot, and then I read the essay too. And I don't know that I was as obsessed with the essay as Ed was, but the end result for me was I ended up listening to a lot of Robbie Fulks records for a while. So it was a nice chain of succession there. But the cool thing about the essay, which you'll see if you click the link and read it, is that Fulks himself is not necessarily paying homage to the great Gordon Lightfoot. He doesn't really know if the music is good or if he likes it. He just knows he can't stop thinking about it and that he has to understand it. And he just sort of keeps going back and digging deeper and trying to see what's there. And to me, that's, I think, the kind of highest form of this kind of thinking. I don't know, is that a fair read on an essay I almost remember having read 4 months ago?
Yeah, I just glanced at it. It's so excellent. It didn't make you listen to any Gord, any Lightfoot.
Definitely listen to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Yeah, yeah. Most musicians who write tend to write with a lot of glee, maybe more glee than the normal writer does. They seem to be so happy to be writing, to be doing something else. Because writing songs is very hard and exacting. And Robbie Fulks, for example, writes lots of songs. But this essay and some other things that he's written, you feel like it's like somebody running away from a prison. I mean, you can feel the freedom of escape from a certain kind of restraint, coming out in a kind of loquaciousness, and in a almost a very excessive style. Who else has done that? John Darnielle, of course, writes very well. Who would be a very unlikely musician to write? Because they often are. One of the strangest things I've read was the Keith Richards autobiography. What is it called? Did you read it?
What was that book called? Light? Was it just Life?
It was just called
My Life.
It's called My Life, and it's incredible. Not just because it's interesting to hear the stories, but he turns out to be a magnificent prose stylist, right? Mm-hmm. And ultimately is even though he's sort of going down all these little digressions. I mean, it turns out to be a great, just kind of testament to creativity and composition. Mm-hmm. Writers are awfully pretentious. You may have noticed.
No,
you hadn't come across that. I find like Present Company Accepted and Suzanne, Sam, and Chris, who seem to be the only people attending, are exceptions. But I don't think I think I'm done writing poetry. And one of the things that made me make that or observe that it's not a decision. I think it's just gone from me, or at least gone from me for a while, very distant to me, is from reading a lot of poetry recently and just feeling utterly disgusted with it. And the ideas behind it, it just seems terribly unimaginative and dull. Which, if you're going to poetry and you're not finding it imaginative and interesting, then
doesn't leave a lot of reasons to do it.
What the fuck are you doing reading it? So I'm interested in finding things that are more imaginative and interesting. And but I also can't picture a poetry that is particularly imaginative and interesting in new ways. And so I'm not going to try. I'll try something else. But I also pick up a book of poems, a new novel, and it feels very churchy in the way that I'm supposed to respond to it. I think, I spend most of my time down at the Mother Foucault's bookshop when I'm not at the house, because we have a little school going down there for some kids of the owner and mine and some of their play group. We're recreating school down there for about 8 kids. And it's filled with, a lot of weighty old tomes that feel like every book wants to be a Bible, right? Every book aspires to be a Bible in some way. But then there's also these great paperbacks from 1950 to 1980 that seem to have no aspirations to be a Bible, right? They are to be purchased for 75 cents, read, enjoyed, provoke thoughts slightly, and left in the back seat of a station wagon, or tossed to the side of a highway, but gotten rid of, right? And that seems like the right place to be for literature, right? That's the right, that feels better. And I think some of that is because it feels like music, right? The way that we listen to music doesn't, most music that I'm attracted to is not as pretentious as the literature that I read. And I prefer the stance of the musician to the stance of writer, as at least in a pessimistic and depressed state, I see that figure to be.
I think I know what you mean. I think that, as someone who has spent most of his life believing in the importance and perhaps the supreme importance of literature, of that capital L, there is a way that it can become really entrapping and almost a kind of cage, and freeing yourself from that culturally imposed or perhaps self-imposed idea of like aspiring toward a Bible, can be really liberating. It means you can do a lot of things, a lot of different things that maybe you weren't thinking about before, and that maybe will end up being, important to someone in some way, yourself or someone else, or not. But I think simply by removing that question as like the central question, to whom is it important? How important will it be? Who will win the important race? It removes a lot of roadblocks, and it lets you try a lot of different things. And I know, even for some of the most important writers I can think of, some of my favorite writers, a lot of times my favorite work of theirs is the minor stuff or the weird stuff or the time when they were trying something. Because I don't know exactly why, and the critic in me would even be sometimes willing to say, this is not this person's best poem or their best book. And yet you see a virtuoso freed from the tyranny of virtuosity. And that's when you start to see something really original and strange, and maybe even unrepeatable. We still have some good 10 or 15 minutes left, but I did notice that we've got a few questions in the queue. Chris, in particular, seems a little alarmed by your abandonment of poetry.
Chris is an old friend.
Well,
he may be concerned about whether when I say I'm done with poetry, whether that means am I okay? And I'm fine. I don't think I'm really done with it, but I'm done with approaching it the way that I've been approaching it for 40 years, since I was 9. Certain relationship to it, which I think is done. I hope to write it again, but I can't picture writing it again. Some of that has everything to do with the cultural shifts of this year, right? I mean, it has everything to do with the changes going on in society and culture, and I'm trying to imagine what role poetry has in it. And for me, the
traditional role, the role as I've seen and experienced it and enjoyed it, does not seem meaningful anymore. Comfort and solace, SOLACE, don't feel like something that I want or am able to offer, or find, or search for. The one of the things is the president's persistence of superlatives, particularly beauty. The way that Trump talks about beauty makes me never want to make anything or witness anything beautiful again. I don't want to make art, you know. And I also feel like nobody wants me to make art, you know, or art to be made. And I certainly, as someone who tries to be courteous, I feel like respecting that. Mm-hmm. What about you, Justin? Are you going to keep writing? You know, Fred Meyers is hiring. I've applied a number of times for butcher positions there, and I may still.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I would like to keep writing. Yeah, but I know what you mean, and I think that my relationship to writing has changed in the past few years and continues to change. There was a certain feeling around finishing Riding with the Ghost, that I had come to the end of something, and although I have other things that I am writing and would like to write, there was a way in which I thought about this as a potential like last book and what that would mean. And I don't know that I came to a definitive answer, but it's not a particularly upsetting thought, I guess. You know, at a certain point you have to ask these questions. You know, I think we were probably both sold a certain model of what not only a career looked like, but also what success looked like, which is that you write the little things and they build toward a big thing, and someone keeps showing up to package them and put them out. And, you know, I think we've both been very lucky. We've got 4 books apiece, and that model has held. But we do see, you know, plenty of evidence that it is no longer holding and may not continue to hold. And so I think it's actually quite wise to start thinking about what a writing life would look like without those,
right,
you know, forget financial rewards, which are meager enough as it is, but really without those structures. You know,
without readers,
or without readers, sure. Yeah, I mean, you know, how many people read, you know, the first edition of Frankenstein or Shelley?
What was she? Was she 19 when she wrote that?
She was 19 when she wrote that. That's pretty good.
It's pretty good.
Pretty good book.
Pretty good.
We should ask, do folks have questions? Those of you who are here, this is probably the good time to ask them if you do.
Well, Suzanne suggests, you know, songwriting maybe, and I do write songs. Have you ever tried to write a song, Justin?
I've never tried to write a song.
Have you made up a song like cooking, just like being around the house?
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
sure. But
yeah.
You know, I don't know how to note the instrumentation.
How to score it?
How to score the symphony that's in my head.
Yeah.
I have to come to your house and sing you my kitchen songs, and then you can set them to banjo.
I will start publishing a music company to put out Justin Taylor's kitchen songs. That would be pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, be pretty good.
But how is songwriting different?
Songwriting is the hardest thing, one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I've written maybe 10 songs in 25 years of trying. And, you know, when people talk about writing fiction or writing poetry, and they say, well, you know, I need to get inspired in order to write. I always, I always kind of dismiss that because that's not how I see the process of writing prose or even poetry as having being when we really have to rely on inspiration. Like you sit down and write, and then the imagination is ready, right? I've found that to be very true, however, in songs. I can't sit down and write a song. A song will come to me, and I need to write it down and write it and finish it within an hour, or it will never happen, right? That it really, it's songs are something that really, or no, I'm not saying my songs are not serious songs. They're kind of goofy songs generally, but the figure that they make in the mind, it presents itself, and then I have to puzzle through it, and both melody and whatever words there are, and it is exhausting, right? And it's almost like an episode of madness that overcomes you in an unexpected moment, and you have to see it through in an obsessive compulsive, not to diminish actual obsessive compulsive, see it through, and then afterwards I am physically and mentally exhausted, and that's strange because it is very different from my experience in other kinds of writing.
And yet at the same time, those songs, I mean, where do you end up performing those songs? At a bar, at a house.
Pumpkin patches, bars, Grateful Dead festivals.
Yeah, so maybe this is what you were talking about before, that this is sort of where you're turning toward the poetry, that the amount of devotion and effort, whether over a long period of time or short period of time, that goes into crafting the work is totally removed and separate from the much more casual and moderate, well-managed expectation of the place in which that work will thrive. All these books that want to be Bibles, but these songs, meanwhile, are being delivered to you like stone tablets on, Mount Sinai, and yet, we're treating them like they're, elevator music, and maybe there's something actually really nice about that.
Yeah. What do you we've talked sitting around the front yard about this, but it's been a week or two since I've seen you.
Yeah.
What have you been working on?
What have I been working on? I am writing about the new Don DeLillo novel. So I have been reading tons of recent DeLillo, and a lot of DeLillo criticism. I mainlined the last 25 years of the Times coverage of him, just because I had to see. Had to see. So that was something. Other than that, I'm hoping to get back to writing stories. I mean, I have about a book's worth that are finished or nearly finished, but I have not yet taken the step of looking at what all that looks like and figuring out, what's going in and what's staying out, and who would want to know about it. But I think that'll be the next big thing. What about you? If you're not writing poetry, you must have some time on your hands. You're running.
I don't. I'm teaching, kindergartners how to read. So I've been making worksheets, doing a lot of work on. This week we're doing eponyms, words based on people's names. And the great revelation of the week is that the word jumbo, and for Missoulians, Mount Jumbo, the name of the elephant precedes jumbo being a term for something very large.
Oh, so it was the elephant first?
The elephant first. Yes, the elephant first.
Huh.
And then things became jumbo, things like jumbo shrimp. Prior to Jumbo the elephant, would just have been called a
shrimp.
A large variety of shrimp.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So that's giving me some joy. But before we go, I did want to ask, because I sort of got you to come to Missoula for a few months. What did you what did you learn from Montana? What did Montana teach you?
What didn't I learn from Montana? I I loved Missoula. It was a great place to be. It was colder than I thought. It was quite a bit colder. One thing I learned was how to walk in the cold. From the X's to that coffee shop downtown that's a few blocks past the bookstore. It seemed very, very far when I got there, like almost impossible to make that walk. And I think by the time I left, I was taking that walk pretty much every day.
Oh.
One, because I liked the coffee shop, and two, just for the sake of the walk.
Which coffee shop? Did it Break Espresso, or where would you go?
Oh yeah, that big old airplane hangar one next to the bar with the Cajun place hidden in the back.
Yeah, the Break.
Break Espresso.
Yeah. I liked that place a lot. I still like it. I mean, I'm sure it's.
Yeah, I wrote most of my third book there at Break Espresso, and Katie O'Keefe's, a sports bar that used to have off-track betting, which no longer does.
Where did you write your most recent collection, Ed? If you could gather all those places into one, if possible.
I guess I must have written it here in Portland. Yeah. So I have a very vivid memory of almost every poem, like where I wrote, especially the poem, the book I wrote in Missoula in 2012, 2013, in a way that I have weirdly no memory of writing this last book. I just love writing. If I could go someplace in Missoula and have my 8x14 yellow legal pad and a pen, someplace to have a cup of coffee, I mean, that's heaven for me. Having 4 or 5 hours in some Missoula coffee shop with a notebook, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I'll second that.
I'll third it. Sure.
All right. Well, we didn't talk about the Grateful Dead with any great length, and we haven't even mentioned one thing we need to mention before we go is most of what we listened to in Missoula was a band called Barefoot Jerry, which no one's ever heard.
No relation to Jerry Garcia, totally unrelated.
The 3 or 4 of you who listen to this, I hope that if you take away anything from this conversation, it's that you should go listen to the band Barefoot Jerry, and multiply.
Barefoot Jerry. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ed and Justin, for joining us. Thank you, audience, for being here as well. I need and would love to shout out the Whitefish Review for supporting this year's festival. I also want to shout out the Camino Mexican Kitchen and Agave Bar. They're one of our sponsors this year. I know you probably know Phil.
Philip Schaefer's bar, yeah. I love that place.
The Camino
we opened while we were there.
That might have been the real answer to what did you learn in Missoula, Justin? We had a number of good long nights at that wonderful, wonderful bar.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. Well, there you go. Thank you, Camino, Phil, everyone, for supporting this year's Montana Book Festival. As a reminder to the audience, you can purchase Ed's collection and Justin's memoir at factandfictionbooks.com. If you go to montanabookfestival.com, you can purchase our merchandise and learn a whole bunch of things there as well. And while you're there, I urge you to donate so that we can keep our virtual programming like this one going through the fall with our MBF Plus events. So again, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Justin. So happy to host you here.
Thank you.
All right.
See you all down the road.
Thanks, everyone.